Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into today's episode of the Money Insights Podcast. I'm Christian Allen. I'm here with my co-host. You know him as Rodney the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what's going on, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. Although this time of year is always a little bit weird. Why? So when we come into the summer, we have all these plans, all the things we're going to do. And then you start to get towards the end of the summer and you realize, man, we really haven't done all the things that we thought we would do. So it's like you're feeling like, man, we got to start pounding these things in, get them done.
So Rod, are you saying that you did not execute on your summer plans?
Well, no, what happens is it's actually apropos for this conversation today, because it's a lot of times unrealistic expectations. We just feel like we make the to-do list, the wish list, and it wasn't going to be realistic to get them all done anyway. So,
okay, well, what I'm hearing is that the Zabriskie family only kind of executed on their summer plans. And that's okay, Rod. That's okay, because it brings us into our conversation today quite nicely, because we're going to talk about how to execute the investment optimizer strategy 100% of the time.
Sweet.
All the way 100% of the time. None of this like 50% stuff. We're going to hit the nail on the head. We're going all the way.
Boom.
So, okay. So I got to talk about where this is coming from. Once in a blue moon, and this doesn't happen very often for us, but once in a blue moon, we have somebody that comes back to us that's, maybe they've had a policy for a couple years. It could have been any time frame, but they'll come back and occasionally be like, I don't know what I was doing when I don't get why I bought it. Or maybe they have whatever. They have specific issues or concerns, and they're thinking, what do I do? Do I close this out? I'm not using it for investing, whatever the case may be. Despite all of our efforts to get people to try to educate and help people make sure they know how to use it, bring it from beginning and use it full circle, there is an element of effort that has to be done from the person who's wanting to execute the strategy, right? So we recently had someone that talked to us, and they brought up a specific issue, and it kind of brought to my head, like, what are the issues that keep people from executing on their investment optimizer strategy? Because I hate, Rod, it brings pain to my soul when somebody comes to me in that situation, because this person doesn't even know that they basically don't know that they're likely to make a financial mistake, but they can't figure out how to think about it in a way that starts to make sense of how to continue to utilize it in the way that it was always meant to be.
Yeah.
So it like literally pains my soul. So the reason I wanted to have this conversation is because I felt like it's important that we make sure that people know what are the specific issues that, the typical issues that come up. And there's obviously one-off issues where people just misunderstand one element here or there, because let's face it, what we're talking about, life insurance is a fairly complex asset, and it takes a little bit of time and effort to understand that, right? And can I also just say that people who don't read it, consume it all day, every day, they come back to it 2 years later and they're like, I kind of forgot some of the elements of how this works, right? So if you're not someone that's actively using it and putting the practice into play, then you might be someone who's could potentially forget and be more prone to coming back to us and being like, well, what the heck, right? So we don't want you to be that, one person a year that's scratching their head and not understanding what happened. We're going to try to set the record straight, Rod. We're going to make sure that we hit on the specific issues that we see people have, in hopes that we can keep others from making the same mistake. Or I should say this, in the situations where it does make sense to drop the policy and move on, that they know that as well. One way or the other, we just want what's best for the individual. And I can say this without any reservation. We're in a unique position today to where the financial element is much less of an issue. If somebody comes to us and they feel like we're certainly not going to put our own financial what's the right word? Our own finances above theirs, it just isn't worth it for in any way, shape, or form. So I guess my point is just to say, I want to make sure that people get to make the right decision based on the facts, based on understanding actually what's going on. Okay, so there's my rant to get us going. Let's jump into it, Rod. What are some of, and I'm going to let you take us through, I think we have 2, 4, 6 listed.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the 6 potential problems that we consistently see happening, starting with the first. Actually, you know what, Rod? I'm changing my mind. We'll just kind of go through these every other. Okay.
Okay.
So I'll kick us off and talk about this first one, and then we'll move in from there. Okay. So the first thing that we see, and this is what we saw most recently. Yep. Now, I have to give a little bit of context for this. This first one, I don't know if the person misunderstood this from the beginning, or if just, stuff crept in over time and then it became a misunderstanding. But at some level, this was a misunderstanding. We had a person who recently came to us and basically was like, well, if I made my first premium payment and then I went out and invested, but then a year later, they're like, well, wait a minute, you're telling me I have to pay this back in order to get value out of it. I have to actually pay the loan back. And of course, we're kind of scratching our heads like, well, yeah, we've only done part of the cycle. Like, of course, we have to continue the cycle, right? And what's even more head scratching, Rod, is that this person was simultaneously telling us they didn't want to do that because it didn't make sense to them, but that they were going to continue to invest money through real estate investment deals, syndications, and things like that, which is exactly what they were doing in the policy. So they didn't want to bring the policy through its full cycle, its full circle, because of a misunderstanding that crept in along the way that suddenly got that kind of blew it up. And they thought that they could make a single payment, take a loan, and still get all of the value out of the policy. And of course, that's just not possible. And we want to be very open with people that isn't possible. However, that very same person could just finish the cycle. If he just finished the cycle and continued to do it for a couple more years, he would have more value doing it that way than he would by doing the exact same flipping thing outside of it. And somehow that fact is lost. It just got lost. And I know why, right? Like, I think one of the questions that he asked us was like, oh, well, what about if I would have taken the cost that I had on the front end of the policy, if I would have taken that cost and invested it, and I'm like, well, here's the deal. We're showing you this, like, we always show people the pro forma, right? Mm-hmm. We show a pro forma that goes over 20 years, and there's a crossover point. In the initial stages, the life insurance account value is less than the other side because of the cost. Yep. But what happens is over time, the cost gets, what's the right word? The cost that was incurred earlier is overcome by the interest that's being accrued in the policy. And so as you get 10, 15, 20 years down, the growth in the policy continues. Like, you continue to create a larger deficit between what you would have had you done this without the policy and what you have now. And yet, in this person's case, they're still asking us, well, what if I do this? And we're just saying, like, well, we're showing you exactly what happens, even if you do that. I'm passionate about this, Rob. Can you tell?
I can tell.
Okay. So anyway, fill in any gaps that, people might be thinking as they listen to my rant. Yeah.
Well, to maybe take this individual situation and expand it a little bit, a variation that we will hear is, I hear out there, right? Again, we don't ever present it this way, but there are other people out there who will say, well, you can take the loan and it's okay if you just never pay it back. And that stated that way it's the true statement, right? In other words, if I take the loan and I have the cash value there that's growing, the growth inside of the cash value is offsetting the interest that I'm accruing on the loan. Well, but then what'll happen is they'll somehow create this kind of crossover where they say, I don't want to pay off the loan, and you told me I can have simple interest on the loan while earning compounding interest on the cash value. And the problem is those both can't work at the same time. In other words, the reason why we talk about simple interest on the loan is because as I invested it and I created some sort of cash flow or returns coming back to me, and I flow that back to policy paying down the loan, that's the mechanism that's making it so it's simple interest on a loan, right? Very much like paying a mortgage or anywhere else where you're paying a loan over time, paying it down. So now you have a decreasing value on your loan and paying less interest each year as a result.
I think this is a really critical point because when I say you, we as policyholders control whether or not the policy is continued on a simple interest basis. Yeah. And maybe that's something that we need to emphasize to people more frequently, but that's a mechanism that, like you said, we actually have control over. And if we don't pay into it, then we do get interest that ends up being accrued and what's the word I'm looking for?
Compounds.
Compound. Yes. Yep. Like we actually have compounded interest that we're dealing with. But by making the payment, we keep that money, simple interest, never get to that accrual point, and now we're creating the arbitrage. But again, to your point, the arbitrage can't happen unless I actually make payments back to it and keep it from happening.
Yes.
Critical. For sure. Okay. So the single payment, that's one that you can't go make a single payment, take a max loan, and then just say like, okay, that's it. If that's what you're thinking, don't do it. I always tell people this: life insurance, even the way we create it, where we're talking about minimum cost, max funded, it's a crappy short-term investment vehicle or even a crappy short-term wealth creation vehicle. It's an incredibly powerful long-term one, right? If I'm going to keep it for a long time, I can go on and on about the many benefits that go around me having this wrapper that is all of these things, tax implications, death benefit, long-term, like all of these things that I get in addition to what I'm getting otherwise, they're always there. Okay, let's leave that. I want to talk about the next one, which is overestimating how much you can actually put in. And this happens on the front end. So what happens typically is people come in and they're thinking like, okay, I make $500,000 and I typically invest, like sometimes people will be like, yeah, I invest like half of, I could probably do 250,000 and they're making 500,000. And we'd be like, yeah, let's not do that. Right. Cause for us, we're thinking, I mean, unless that person had a whole bunch of reserves in other places to supplement besides income, we'd be like, no, we can't do that. But oftentimes people can come in thinking, and this happens on both sides, we're going to talk about this, but sometimes they overestimate what they can put in. And the reason that's so critical is because we don't want people coming back a year later and saying like, hey, I put my first premium in and I max funded it so that it's really putting like 4 years worth of premium in and one single lump sum. But we still don't want people coming back and being like, oh, I don't think I could ever do that again, right? Because suddenly you put your policy in a more difficult position where we can still get value out of it, but we have to do it differently, right? We have to, we'll talk about the mechanisms we can do to maximize or optimize the policy at that point. But most often, we're not getting the full value if we go in with that overestimation and find out that we have to pull it back entirely. Now, the good news is that there's a funding range. So there's a huge amount of flexibility to where if I had to go, let's say that I put my first year's premium in and it was 100,000 and the second year I could only put 50,000 in. It's not a big deal, right? And then the next year I put 50,000 in, 100,000, whatever. Like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the people who go from putting in 100,000 to feeling like they cannot put anything in moving forward. In those situations, we're running into a more difficult position where we have to, utilize the policy mechanisms to optimize the value that I get back out of it. But it's not going to be the same value that I would get by utilizing it and executing the full strategy.
Absolutely. And we'll get into some of the things that the contingency plans that can come into play here if anyone finds himself in this situation. But to your earlier point, on the front end, we're always being just really super careful, methodical about the way that we have that conversation so that we're creating a funding range that is appropriate. So that whatever that minimum end of the range is, people are saying, yeah, I'm okay here, even if kind of worst case scenario, something happens, I'm feeling good about hitting that minimum.
Okay, Rod, this is going to sound self-promotional, and it is a little bit. So warning, a little bit of self-promotion here. But I do think this is important because as life insurance advocates and people who sell life insurance, we're often you know, immediately put out there as people who will only do things for money, commission, like somehow because it comes in commission form instead of a fee form, we like are more money hungry than someone that uses fee. But how many times have you seen me tell somebody, and I know I don't do calls anymore, but back in the day, how many times did you see me tell somebody to reduce the amount of money that they're putting in the policy because it wasn't going to be, or we didn't think it would be in their best interest?
Yeah, I know it is a common conversation that we have with people. And usually what we say is, hey, choosing to do less now doesn't mean you have to do less forever, but let's do something that makes sense for you today that we can make sure that everything's totally comfortable. And then if you end up, 2, 3, even 6 months down the road, 5 years down the road, whatever it is, then you're saying, okay, now I'm ready to do more. Well, we can increase the funding capacity, right? Stack another policy on top of it. You keep funding the first one. We create another one. Now we've increased that capacity to now a new appropriate place. And simultaneously, the further you get in, 2 or 3 years into the first policy, you've created more flexibility for yourself because as you build cash value in the policy, now you have more options at your disposal. So, but anyway, the answer to your question is, that's a common conversation for sure.
And you can always throw in convertible term as if you don't want to go through underwriting a second time in the future, you can throw it on there when you're younger and thinking, hey, I can grow into this amount. Anyway, the point is we're trying to avoid the pitfalls. And one of the pitfalls is going too big. Now, like I said, we're fortunate. We have probably 12 or 1,300 clients at this point, and it's super rare that we have to have that conversation, but happens like once a year. And every time it kind of hurts my heart when people misunderstand the value proposition and aren't getting, what they wanted out of it. My hope is that we can clarify this.
Absolutely.
Okay. So overestimating, underestimating. The next one is unrealistic expectations. Rod, talk to us about what types of unrealistic expectations that people can get caught up in that can cause problems in their policy.
Yeah. Well, so going back to the earlier point where you made is in this example, they said, well, if I can't just make a single payment, take the loan and not ever pay it back, then it's just not going to be worth it for me to.
There's no value. Well, okay. And then it was worse, Rod. It was like, it might be worth it for people who have millions that, who are super rich to do this. And so it was interesting because you were like, well, how are you going to be investing moving forward? And he's like, oh, I'm going to be doing exactly what we talked about. I'm going to put money into real estate syndications. And, I probably put, 100, 150, 200. Like, I don't remember the number that we talked about specifically, but like, it seemed very much like he was planning to do the same plan that we started with in the policy, just do it outside of it.
Yeah.
That one was hard for me to make sense of.
Yeah. And so, but this gets back to the point is we had to trace it back to some sort of unrealistic expectation. Like you said earlier, whether it was in the beginning or somewhere along the way, it developed into an unrealistic expectation of, well, and put it this way. So we often talk about the flexibility that exists so the funding range is an example, right? Creates a lot of flexibility in how much I have to put in. I'm not committing to again, in your example, the 100,000, I'm committing to 25,000 or something much less than that. And so my funding range from year to year is that 25 to 100. But if I go into it saying, oh, that's great that I can put 100,000 in, I'll plan on 25. That's not the right way to approach it either. Right. And we'll talk about in a minute.
Not only is it not the right way, it's a terrible way to approach it because in that first year, most of that is going to end up being your cost, right? So when we talk about having 80% cash value in the first year, it's because the base premium, that minimum number that we talk about in our funding range, a lot of that in the first year is eaten up in cost. So we have to fund beyond that point to create the cash value that we want to start working for us.
Yeah, because it gets better, right? In year 2,
much better. And it gets to the point where here's the thing, right? It gets to the point where you just like love putting money into the policy because when you put money into the policy, it creates immediately more cash and more more interest that's occurring and more death benefit. All of those things are happening to where I get that. I get why people can struggle initially seeing the hit on the cash. Like I totally get it. Like we all get that. And yet, if you can look at the long-term opportunity that exists there, it just ends up being such a no-brainer because you're literally missing out on nothing that you were doing otherwise. You're only gaining those things with the caveat that can I do without that 20% hit that I took on that first year?
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, but that's we can get into a deeper dive on that later. But I want to stay focused on some of these kind of critical things that people are kind of critical missteps that people make.
Yeah.
So we talked about unrealistic expectations, or I'll talk a little bit about, we talked about the funding range, talk about the loan payback element.
Yeah. So the other part of it that we talk about where we have flexibility is when we take a loan, we have complete latitude on how we want to pay that loan back. Right. And it makes the most sense to me. I took the money, I went and invested it somewhere. It's creating some sort of cash flow coming back to me. Let's take that cash flow and use that, flowing it back, paying towards the loan, creating simple interest, paying down the balance so that then I'm freeing those funds up to go out and invest in something else later. Right. Again, we talk about the cycle. Well, if someone goes in saying, well, I have flexibility on how I pay my loan back, so maybe I'll just take the loan and not plan on paying it back. And the scenario a minute ago, and all I'm committing to is the minimum. So I have all this flexibility that's built into the plan, so I'm good. Well, don't go in with that plan. Don't go in saying I have all this flexibility, therefore I'm going to take advantage of all of the flexibility. Because if that's the way you approach it, you're not going to get all the value back out of it either. The flexibility exists as a backup plan, right? I'm planning on putting 100,000 a year in, but I like the fact that I could only put 25 if it came to that, right?
That's the maximize and optimize, right. Not how do I get the minimum value out of my policy? Right. Because doing this, what you said, creates literally the worst value proposition in the policy I can get, while doing the other creates the optimal value I can get, and over time those will make a big difference. So if you're going in with the idea that I'm going to do the minimum on it, just don't do the strategy. Simple as that.
Yeah,
right?
or change the minimum to your max, and so your funding
change
range
the minimum. So
25 is the maximum, and whatever 6,000 is a minimum, right?
Right. Whatever works. Like your point is that you should go in thinking I'm going to put in, and we always tell people, plan to put in the maximum amount of premium for 3 years. If you can do it for 3 years, you'll be good. Like you don't have to even put more money in after that if you don't want to. Now, I always say that with the caveat that once you get the idea of the strategy, like that's the whole point, and you want to. You continue to flow it through. You increase the value of that's the whole point, right?
Yep.
Instead of having $1 million of cash value, I want to invest and create $2 million of cash value. So anyway, I get that, but the point is the flexibility does give you that ability to do that. Having said that, you've got to go in thinking optimize and maximize in order to get the true value that you want out of it. Okay. The next one that I think is really important, Rod, and this happens probably 99% of the time that we lose a policy, which again, we're really grateful to say happens very rarely, but on those rare occasions when it happens, it's almost always at least partially because there's a lot of voices that somebody's hearing. Now, this one is really tricky for me because I think it would be ridiculous to be like, don't listen to different voices. Like, you should just listen to the Money Insights team about anything finance related. Okay, that's asinine, right? It's completely ludicrous and ridiculous. Having said that, there's some sort of balance that has to happen. If you can build trust and belief in understanding and knowing that you're working with people that, one, have your best interest at heart, and number two, are competent and very, understand it, and then maybe number three, have a track record of delivering their promise to the people that they work with. Yeah. Like, that's what you work with. The challenge is that in our space, in the financial space, everybody is out for business, right? So when you talk to somebody, there's just a natural conflict of interest that exists among everybody, right? The person that you're talking to now likely wants you to move away from the life insurance piece. Why? Is it because they want your money to go somewhere else? Do they want to be the one that sells the life insurance, maybe they would say that should go into a different type of deal altogether. Maybe there's a lot of reasons why that could be happening, but the chances are, and maybe it could be that they just don't understand it themselves, which, can I just say, is probably the most likely situation, because the percentage of people that we talk to that come to us with like concerns about life insurance just generally don't understand the mechanics of how it actually works. And once they do, they get it. Like, I think about this, Rod. I'm going to drop a name here. Like, so we work with Anderson Business Advisors, right? And it's a national legal and tax firm. And I just think about it and I'm like, okay, if they didn't, like, these are really smart people who have been working in the financial real estate space for a long, long time.
Yep.
And they see the value, belief, and promote the concept of utilizing life insurance as a wealth creation tool to their, thousands and thousands of clients. Like, okay, here's the deal. You can't just say because one organization does something that it's value, but there has to be some merit behind it, right? And I guess what I'm saying here is, like, find the merit, find the value that's there. You do have to listen to multiple voices, but I would say listen to them, lock in on one, build a trusting relationship, and stick with it, right? Unless, of course, you're having some major red flags, right? Like, I get that there's situations where they come up, but again, in most of these situations, the red flag is, well, is the life insurance doing exactly what I thought it was? Like, it's not a huge red flag.
Yeah, well, and I think it's keeping things straight in your head. And I realize it's easier said than done, but in this case, what happened was we would get in the conversation. He would say, well, you guys said this. And there was,
and we'd be like, wait a minute, we never say that.
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 points where it was just like, oh no, that is like the opposite of what we're saying. And so what happened is there got to be this confusion of, oh, I'm talking to friends, CPA, whoever it was, and they're telling me this, but then all of a sudden it became confused in his head to where he said, well, you said I should do these things. And it's like, wait, hold on, let's take a step back. And really in this case, it was just getting back to the core strategy itself. The core strategy itself makes sense when you do, again, we're going to get in here in a minute, when you do these specific things. But if you're not doing these specific things, then it's not going to give you the value.
Okay, so I want to be careful about something. I want to be careful about placing victim blame. I don't know if I call it victim blaming because they're not necessarily victims, but like maybe victims of themselves in a lot of ways. But here's the deal. I want to like publicly apologize to anybody who feels like they've ever been misled into thinking one of these potential problems is the way that we are promoting and suggesting people use life insurance. It just absolutely isn't. And I think if any unbiased person were to watch any of our material, they would agree that we're very much promoting doing the opposite of these things, right? And yet, like, I've been on both sides of this where maybe I misunderstood something. So I don't want to blame. And the person that we're talking about is super cool. They're just trying to understand it and do the right thing for their situation and their family. Like, so I don't want to blame that person. And yet I also want to make the very definitive point that if they could take that step back and remember why they initially did it, instead of being so distrusting and assuming everything that we say is inaccurate or misleading, then they could easily get the value out of the policy. And again, it just pains me that that's proving to be a difficult thing to get to. And again, I don't think it's actually it's probably not due to one of these singular issues. It's really due to several of these issues coming into focus and just creating a cloud of confusion. And can I just tell you this person that we're talking about, like, it is difficult for, like, they're still trying to work this out. Like, it's not a definite, Rod's been going back and forth, having additional conversations, trying to help create clarity, because at the end of the day, I don't care whether this person keeps their policy with us or not. I mean, I do in the sense that I like them personally. And I'd love to continue to do business. And, we make a little bit of money on an ongoing basis by having them. So like, I care in that sense, but like, it's not going to make any difference in my world one way or the other. but it will make a difference in theirs. And what I mean by that is if you're somebody who's in a situation like that and you decide, hey, I'm going to put in one premium, invest, and then, that's it. Like suddenly you're in a position where the policy has probably been a detriment rather than a value. That's where I get pain, right? So make sure as you're going into the policy that you're doing it with enough comfort, enough knowledge that you can confidently, that's probably the better word, enough confidence that I can go in and know that I'm going to push this thing full cycle for a few years. And I promise anybody, if they do that, they will never regret utilizing the investment optimizer strategy because it's just so incredibly valuable. Okay. We talked about listening to voices. Okay. The last one, Rod, this one's huge. Do you want to touch on this one?
Yeah. So this one is thinking of the insurance policy as the investment.
Okay, Rod, this might be the number one reason that people I have to clarify this and then I'm going to turn it back to you. People don't generally come back to us and have this issue later, although it happens occasionally, right?
Sure.
Like, again, rarely. But when the place that this most commonly shows itself up is when they're trying to determine whether to move forward and use the strategy or not. Right?
Yes, that's true.
It's such a common issue, but both sides, it's important regardless of where you're at in the process to understand this. And I think it's the biggest piece of confusion that exists within the strategy that we teach. Okay.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah. And you might be listening to that and say, well, G-Rod, and this was the case in this conversation, but you're telling me it provides all this value. How can I not think of it as the investment?
The investment.
And the answer to that is, well, yes, of course it brings value. What we're saying is instead of running your money through a savings account, money market account as your opportunity fund, you're running it through the policy because of the benefits it gives you. But don't let it stop there. Don't put the money in and just think that you're going to get all the value just because it's sitting in the policy, because that's not the strategy. The policy itself is predictably going to provide you a 5+% tax-free return, give you liquidity, give you safety, give you long-term care benefits, death benefit, all the different things that we talk about. But we're not saying do those things instead of using money and putting it into life insurance, into real estate or your business or these other places. We're saying do both, right?
And that's
where the
huge.
value comes out, is by doing both.
Yep. It's not the investment. And again, think of it more like a vehicle, it's almost more like an IRA, right? Like you put your money in the IRA and you can invest within the IRA. The IRA is like the tool you're using. Now, there's some differences because cash value life insurance, when you put it into whole life or an IUL or whatever, has a specific set of mechanics that grows the cash that you put in there, but it also has a tax wrapper,
Yep.
right? And so you're taking it and you're saying, I want this tax wrapper. And I really like this, 5% that I just get for having it here. And I like these other 5 or 6 benefits that I get from it while still being able to go and invest in real estate just like I did otherwise. Yeah. And that's the critical element. Okay, Rod. So those are the primary things that we see getting people kind of tripped up. There's not that many of them. If you can avoid those pitfalls and make sure that there's clarity, then it'll be really easy to execute on the investment optimizer strategy. Like, it really is outrageously simple. You do the exact same thing you did before. You just put the money in the life insurance policy and you use that to do the investing. When you get money from your investments, you put it back there. When you get the money that you would invest from your income, you put that there first. All you do is those things. And just by doing that, 20 years later, you'll have significantly more money than you would have had you not had the life insurance policy. Plus, you'll have a massive death benefit and all the other value that you can get. Okay, so I want to focus on how to optimize now that we've talked about really the potential issues, potential problems that we can run into. So here are some things that we think are super important that give us, that kind of put us on the right track and allow us to optimize the policy so that we're not one of those, one people a year that comes back to Rod and says, wait, what am I doing here? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Rod, tell us how to optimize it.
Yeah, so we've hit on this a little bit, but the first thing is go in planning to max fund it for at least 2 years. Okay, now earlier Christian said 3. So, but where this comes from is if you max fund it for at least 2 years, now you're getting yourself ahead of the curve. In other words, the costs are highest in the first 2 years. So the more money we can put in there, creating as much growth as possible, that's giving us the most opportunity to, number one, offset those costs, and then number two, getting ahead so that the majority of the money is going into the cash value instead of, because again, if I set up the policy, it's $100,000 max and I only put in 50 in the first year, well, I'm not going to get the 70 to 80% cash value that we normally get. I'm going to get 50 to 60%, right? So optimizing it in that way is giving me the best opportunity, the best starting point in the policy. And then after that, there's more flexibility, et cetera. But the second part of that is we want to get to a place where we've put in at least 12 times that minimum amount. Okay. So that's where the 3 years came from. In this example, if 25,000 is my minimum and I max it out, I hit 100,000 a year for the first 3 years. I got to my quickest point where now this policy can be self-sustaining. And what I mean by that is our rule of thumb is when I've put in 12 times that minimum number, then the policy, even if I never put another dime into it again, in terms of the premium side, the funding side, then it has enough value there that it's creating enough growth basically so that not only is it continuing and can cover any ongoing costs, it covers the costs and keeps growing the cash value so that long-term you still end up with that 5+% IRR, right?
Super important. Now, I want to clarify something because what you don't want to be doing is thinking, I'm going to do the same thing. And that, like, say I put in 3 years, the full 100,000 in our example that we're using here, and I take out my loan, my max loan, use it for investments. We're still not suggesting just take the loan and never do anything again. Now, right. The policy could probably run still for a long time, even if that were the case, right? Might even still run indefinitely. I mean, it still run indefinitely, but that's not how to optimize it. To optimize it, I still want to pay the policy back. So what Rod was specifically saying is no new premium money, but we still want to pay the loans back. Again, that's the whole point of it, right? Like in no other situation would we just take a loan, invest, and be like, all right, I'm done, right? That's not logical, right? We're using it as a tool. It's not magic. It's a tool that mathematically creates real value. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, well, that leads us perfectly into the next one because we want people to be using the strategy, right? We're talking about executing the investment optimizer strategy. Well, do that, right? So you've put the money in, and often what we find is people, they've put the money in and then they're not using it. And a lot of times it's not because they're not investing, it's because they maybe they were overly cautious. And I want to be careful
they're
using
investing
that word
the money outside of it.
Yeah, we want them to be
happening.
Cautious going in. But yeah, that's it. They have a lot more money they're setting aside for investing than what they put in the policy. And so they're investing that money instead of using the money here, which makes sense, right? If that's the situation I find myself in, that's what I would do as well. But the point is to build an appropriate policy for the strategy and use it and do the complete cycle. Put the money in, create the cash value, take the loan against it, invest it, create those cash flows, returns, however that is that comes back, flow that back towards the policy, pay it towards the loan, which again keeps the interest simple and replenishes the opportunity fund because I'm going to go back out and do it again. So the complete cycle includes rinse and repeat because, again, bringing that money back, we don't want to get back into a situation where we're trying to make the policy the investment. We're bringing it back in to free up those funds because I'm going to go and invest it again. Again, it's the same cycle as people are using in their opportunity fund with the savings account, right? Create the cash flow, build the savings account up again, go invest it again. In this case, the mechanics are a little bit different, but the point is the same. I'm flowing that money through, in this case, to be paying down the loan, so I free up those funds and go out and invest it again.
Okay, Rod. So you've hit on some important stuff. One, we want to make sure we max fund the policy for at least the first couple of years. We need to use it actively for investing in order to get the optimal value, right? I also want to say this, like some people end up deciding like, oh, I'm going to have cash that sits in my policy that's there as a slush fund for emergencies or things like that. That can be a very appropriate use of cash as well. We're just saying in order to optimize the ultimate value, you want to be able to invest, create a higher return than what you're paying in interest. And by doing that, that's how we kind of create the maximum arbitrage. But there's still value in the policy just there itself, right? Because let's say that I typically have my emergency fund in my checking account. And if I'm a high income earner, it's not atypical to have a couple $100,000 in a checking account.
Yep.
Well, if all things are equal, why not have that in the policy where it's growing, producing a return, creating more death benefit, all of those other things? It just makes more sense, right? So anyway, in order to optimize that, we can also multi-purpose it for other things in addition to using it for investing. And then the last thing, Rod, we always talk about phase 2, and that is using the money as a retirement income vehicle. And man, I love the concept because if you think about it, it's like it basically brings everything full cycle, right? So in a typical high income earner's career, they're going to start making money. They're going to have excess money. They're going to start investing that money, right? They're going to invest the money, create more money through the investment, and then they're going to want to turn that investment or that money into some sort of way to create income in retirement. Well, the policy, just like real estate, basically creates this full cycle stream, right? Because I put it in there, it's tax deferred. When I pull it out through loans, it ends up being tax free. So the final piece of maximizing or optimizing the investment optimizer strategy is to utilize it for tax-free retirement income and, I guess I shouldn't say final, death benefit.
Yeah.
The combination of retirement income and what's left at that point comes to me in a death benefit. And by doing all of those things together, it's kind of silly how much more value I get by doing that versus not doing it.
Yeah. Right? And it's a great point. And I'm glad you brought it up because every once in a while we'll have somebody will be like, okay, great. Well, I've built up all this value in the policy, but doesn't that mean I have to die in order for anyone to get value? I love my kids, but I don't want to just do this just for that sake. And the answer is, well, no, this cash value, that's your money. You can use it however you want while you're living. In this case, it's a great tool for tax-free income in retirement.
Okay, Rod. So I want to finish today's episode off by talking about some of the contingency plans that we have. Now, I don't want to get into a deep dive because we could do a full episode on contingency plans, but I want to make sure that people understand that there are solutions, right? And there's a lot of solutions before and that are likely a lot better than, hey, I put money in a policy for a year or two, something came up, and now I'm just going to try to walk away from it, cash out. That's probably your worst scenario. And again, we'll talk about it from a financial perspective. And that's at the end of the day where our focal point is. Okay, so Rod, without going into too much detail, because I know you could, talk to us about some of the contingency plans.
Yeah, so the first thing is make sure you're talking to us, right? In other words, we helped set up, we know the plan. We know what the original intent was in putting the policy together. So coming back to us and saying, hey, I've run into a snag, or I have questions. Like I ran into, some issues, or I'm not remembering, maybe I misunderstood some things. The biggest thing I don't want people to take away from this episode is for you to feel like, oh, these guys don't want to talk to me because if I misunderstood or if I whatever. We absolutely want that. That's why we're here, right? So it is very common for people as we're having our annual reviews with people on their policies, for them to come back and say, hey, I need some clarity on these few things. I got fuzzy on it, or I'm not understanding it. And we absolutely want that. Please do that. And especially in a situation like this, where now you feel like you're in kind of like an emergency situation, SOS, either something happened in my financial world that created the SOS situation, or my misunderstanding is making me feel like I'm in a tough situation here with my policy. Come talk to us, because the kinds of things that we can do, we'll go back and talk about your funding range, right? We created flexibility on the front end. We want to make sure, because believe it or not, some people forget that they have that flexibility. They'll come in and they'll say, oh, well, I'm feeling like I'm committed to this 100,000 number every year. And so I get to remind them, okay, no, the good news is you're not committed to that number. You have a lot of flexibility there. And that's a relief for people in that situation. So we can talk about that. But even the base premium, the minimum portion of the funding range, can be broken up into a monthly or quarterly payment or something like that. So if you've traditionally paid it as a lump sum, and then you get to that point, you're like, oh man, I'm right in a cash crunch right now. I can't do the full lump sum. Well, great, we can break that up. So just realize that. And then finally, if you're past that kind of 12x number we talked about earlier, you've paid 12 times the base, and now you're at a place where your new funding range is anywhere between 0 and whatever the max was, right? So in other words, we can let the cash value help us pay that minimum and get you past the tight point, or again, like I said earlier, it could be that we do that forever, right? If you're just not going to put more money into it. So briefly, right, that's very brief, but those are kind of some of the directions that we can go with it to create that leeway for you to get to a place of recovery.
Okay, Rod, quick recap, and then we're going to close this thing up. I think you hit on the main and critical points, but maybe the most critical is just come have a conversation with us and we'll help you execute the plan. And again, we'll make sure that you're getting the optimal result, even if that result means, okay, your best bet actually is to cash out and move on, right? We'll just be very open and tell you if that's the best bet, and we can play it out mathematically to see, what ends up making the most sense. Okay, so quick recap. We talked about a handful of things that we occasionally see people run into. Most of the time it's due to confusion, misunderstandings. So again, come talk to us before going too far down that road. And then we talked about how to optimize the policy. Rod hit on the contingency plans. I think this has been a fun episode. Rod, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I'm good.
Okay, thanks everybody for hanging out with us today, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth-building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.